There are moments in life that split everything into a before and an after. They aren't always the big moments, the ones you can predict, the ones you prepare yourself to receive. Sometimes it's something too small to have a name, a look that lasts a second longer than it should, a scar you weren't meant to see, and the way someone catches you looking, and instead of shutting down, opens up. My name is Lucas. I'm 27, I'm a veterinarian, and I moved to Boa Esperança do Cerrado thinking I could start over. Thinking distance would fix the things we carry inside. It doesn't. What does? What changed everything? I didn't expect to find in a corral about 9 miles from town, on a Tuesday afternoon, in a cow that wasn't well. But I'll get there. First, let me tell you about the place. The town sits inland in Minas Gerais. One of those that don't show up on maps unless you're lost on purpose, or trying to get lost. Red earth, dry heat that cracks your lips even in winter. The smell of brush and cattle that you stop noticing after a few days, but that still clings to your clothes and hair. The kind of place where everyone already knows your name before you learn theirs. Where silence is currency. Where what isn't said weighs more than what is spoken. A town that breathes slowly and watches everything. I had arrived from São Paulo 3 weeks earlier when I realized I'd made a mistake. Not the mistake of going there, the mistake that made me need to go there in the first place. But going back would be another kind of failure, and I'd failed plenty of ways that year. I'd quit a job that was slowly destroying me. I'd left an apartment I shared with someone I was never honest enough to truly disappoint. I'd arrived somewhere no one knew me, carrying the suitcases of a life I wanted to rebuild from scratch. Not yet understanding that what needed rebuilding wasn't in the suitcases. It was inside me. I rented a room at Dona Edite's. She was 62, had 2 cats, a sharp tongue disguised as friendliness, and the habit of knowing everything before it happened. She was the most well-informed woman in the municipality without ever having to leave it. The town came to her, in the form of students from the school where she'd once been an assistant, daughters of acquaintances who came asking for advice, newcomers who needed a room, and someone to tell them everyone's name. She welcomed me like a prodigal son returning home, with genuine affection and questions I wasn't ready to answer. "You're new around here, but you're not new to suffering, are you?" she said the first night, as she set my plate on the table with the precision of someone who's done this her whole life. People who carry a burden like that on their shoulders walk in a particular way. I smiled and said I was fine. She didn't believe me. But she had the kindness not to press it that night, leaving the observation hanging between us like something we'd return to later. The room was small, the mattress hard, and the window looked out onto a yard with an old swing that rocked when the wind came. That slow, wide tree swing that has lived long enough not to hurry anymore. I would lie there staring at the uneven plaster ceiling and think, this is where the rest of my life starts. Or at least the version of it I can bear. I spent the first weeks being the new vet who didn't bother anyone. I did my work, saw my clients, went back to Dona Edite's room, ate dinner, slept badly, woke up, and repeated. It was sustainable in the way most unsustainable things are, as long as you don't stop to really look at what's actually happening. The work was varied enough to keep me busy, and routine enough to numb me. Cattle, mostly. A few small animal cases brought in by farmers with kids who insisted on having a dog or cat. A heron that showed up with a damaged wing and that Juninho, my 19-year-old assistant, wanted to save with a touching seriousness. The life of a country veterinarian is less dramatic than it sounds. More herd management than heroic surgery, more prevention than cure, more conversations with owners about cost-benefit than anything like what I studied in the early years of vet school. But I liked it. It was concrete. It was real. They were problems that had solutions, and when they didn't, at least they ended. Have you ever pretended so much that you almost believed your own lie? I'm not talking about the small white lies of everyday life, the ones we tell out of courtesy, laziness, convenience. I'm talking about building an entire life on top of a lack, raised with such care that sometimes you yourself lose track of where the real ends and the version you needed to be true begins. An identity built around a hole, where the whole becomes invisible under all the things stacked around it. I was 27 and very good at pretending. Until the day I was called out to Fazenda Esperança. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was going over old files at the clinic. A deep, economical voice that said little beyond what was necessary. He had a cow that wasn't well. It needed an evaluation. Could I come today? The voice wasn't rude. It was the kind of directness of someone who respects other people's time because he respects his own. I wrote down the address, grabbed my bag, and went. The farm was about 15 kilometers from town, down the dirt road that ran northeast through pasture and Cerrado. It was a medium-sized property, well-kept, functioning, but not showy. Fences in good repair, fat, calm cattle, a main shed with a corrugated roof and open sides, and a simple exposed brick house where the yard was more practical than ornamental. A few tomato seedlings on one side, a lemon tree in the middle, grass cut but not trimmed. The kind of place built by someone who worked hard and spent little on vanity. Someone who wanted the place to work, not to impress. He was outside when I arrived, facing away, fixing something on the gate beam with a wrench, the slow, methodical movement of someone who'd done it hundreds of times and knows exactly how much force each bolt needs. He didn't turn around the instant my car stopped. He finished what he was doing first. Rafael, 31 years old. Shoulders that looked like they were made by years of work, not by the gym. Sun-dark skin. Not a burn but a permanence. The mark of someone who lives outdoors. Hands that told a story before any words. Hands you saw and immediately understood new tools, animals, soil. When he finally turned to greet me, his expression wasn't hostile, but it wasn't open either. It was the face of someone who learned early that people generally disappoint, and prefers not to need them much so he won't be disappointed. "The vet," he said, not as a question, as recognition of a fact. "Lucas," I said, holding out my hand. He shook it. Firm, quick, practical, without the over-enthusiasm of someone trying to impress, or the coldness of someone keeping distance. "Rafael, the animals in the corral." And that was that. No welcome ritual. No mandatory coffee that precedes everything in the countryside. No small talk about the weather or the town. I followed him to the corral, which sat behind the shed, smelling of wet earth and dung and that specific bovine smell that's not unpleasant when you grew up with it. Which I didn't, but learned to tolerate and later in a way to like. I examined the cow. A hoof infection. Treatable. Nothing dramatic or urgent. I gave care instructions, prescribed treatment, estimated recovery time. Rafael listened attentively, asking the right questions. Not too many, not too few, all relevant. The kind of person who, when he wants to know something, asks directly. When he doesn't, stays silent. I was already folding my notepad when it happened. Rafael was standing beside a wooden post supporting the corral, reaching for a rope tied to a high cleat above his head. The motion lifted his t-shirt, and I saw. The scar ran along the left side of his ribs, starting around the hip line and curving upward and inward in a long, old line. Not the redness of a fresh wound, but the paler, almost silvery color of something healed long ago. It was long. It curved in a way that suggested blunt force, not a cut. The shape a rib fracture leaves when the skin splits from the inside out. And it had an extent you don't see in minor accidents. I looked. I know I shouldn't have stared so long, but I did. And he caught me looking. It wasn't a noisy catch. There were no shouts, no overt embarrassment, no reaction like someone who feels violated. It was a quiet, dense thing. The moment our eyes met across the space between us, me still holding the notepad, him still with his arm raised, and it was clear to both of us that I had seen, and that he knew I had seen. The mutual awareness of a shared exposure. A second. Maybe two. Then he lowered his arm. The shirt fell back into place, and he went on talking about the dressing change schedule for the cow as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. I can't explain exactly what. It wasn't just the scar. Scars aren't uncommon on farmers, and I've seen worse. It was the way he reacted to catching me looking. There was no hurry to cover up. There was no hostility, no quick defensive move to erase what had been exposed. It was something else. A deliberate, almost calculated pause before carrying on, like someone who lets it be seen before putting it away again. Before I left, still at the gate, Rafael said, "Want to see up close?" Calm. No flourish. Like offering something that has no price and no urgency. I said no, thank you, it was fine. I went back to the car and drove off, but the question didn't leave with me. That night, on Donna Edith's hard mattress, I did what I always do with things that bother me. I tried to dissect them until they lost their weight. I looked because I'm trained to observe. I'm a veterinarian. The body of a living being is a text I read for a living, and the human body isn't that different. The scar stood out for its unusualness, for its length. It was a clinical observation. Period. That held for about 20 minutes. You know that moment when you stop believing your own bullshit? When the argument you've repeated so many times just doesn't land anymore? That's when I started thinking about his hands. Raphael's hands bore the kind of marks work leaves when it's done for real. Not the decorative roughness of someone who exercises in a park, but the true texture of someone who fixes fences in cold mornings, hauls bags of feed, and drives a tractor through muddy fields for years. The skin between the fingers lighter than the back of the hand, which was too dark. The knuckles a different color, the kind that comes from repeated impact with hard surfaces. Hands that had worked every day of their lives, not as ornament, but as tools. I was thinking about the hands of a man who had seen me for 40 minutes on a farm about 9 miles from the town where I live now. A man whose voice I had barely heard. I stopped thinking. Or I tried to. Here's the thing about things you decide not to think about. They don't care. They just keep going, happening in the background while you pretend they aren't. The hose in the yard clinked outside. I stared at the ceiling until sleep came, which took a long time. The cow hadn't improved in 3 days. I got a short message. 1 line, no preamble, no signature, none of the emojis most people tack on even when they don't want to, saying he'd need to come back for a second visit. I scheduled it for a Friday afternoon. This time it was different from the start. Not in an obvious way, nothing an outsider could have pointed to and named. Raphael was still sparing with words, still the kind of man who didn't waste gestures or conversation, but there was something tuned differently in the air between us. A specific pressure I recognized without knowing of what. The weight of an unresolved moment that both know exists, and neither will mention directly. A kind of implicit elephant that both pretend not to see, but around which both move carefully. I examined the cow. It was improving, as I expected. The infection responding well to medication, the hoof looking better. I adjusted the dosage, advised on the next few days, made the notes. When I was finishing, Raphael said, without looking directly at me, "There's shade in the barn, if you want to rest before you head back." It wasn't exactly an invitation. It was an observation, offered sideways, like someone noting a fact and passing it along without commitment. But I said yes. We sat on a long wooden bench at the barn's entrance, the sort of bench found in every old farm barn, worn and warped by decades of use, with the harsh afternoon brightness outside and the cool shade of the barn wrapping around us. Raphael brought coffee without asking if I wanted any. 2 aluminum cups, dark, strong, black. The kind you don't ask for sugar with because the question would already say something about you. We drank without hurry. He spoke about the farm. About his father, who had arrived on that land with nothing but a sharecropping agreement with a neighbor and a bank loan that took 18 years to pay off, one by one, without missed payments. About how the cattle he raised were the same crossbreed his father used, Nelore with Angus, well suited to the region, because changing the crossbreed felt like a disloyalty he couldn't rationalize, even though it probably made financial sense. About last year's drought that had been expensive in supplemental feed, and how the current year was still paying that debt to the city veterinarian. He said all this in the cadence of someone used to speaking little, and when he does, making it count. There was no waste in the way Raphael used words. Each one carried weight, none were decorative. And there was something in the way he chose what to tell, a specific care, like someone selecting what to show and what to keep, that made me feel I was being entrusted with something, even if I didn't know exactly what. I listened. I spoke little. I'm good at listening. I always have been. It's safer than talking. When you listen, you don't reveal. And when you're used to not revealing, the active silence of listening becomes a comfortable hiding place. It was the longest conversation I'd had since I arrived in that town. As I was getting up to leave, Raphael said, almost as a casual observation, not pausing what he was doing with his hand. The scar came from an accident, 6 years ago. He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't wait for an answer. He went back to fiddling with something on the bench next to him, as if he'd said anything else, as if he'd mentioned the price of corn or the rain forecast. I said, "I see," and I got in the car. On the drive back, I tried to understand why he had said that. He didn't need to. I hadn't asked. I had looked, yes, but I hadn't asked, I hadn't commented. I had even declined the offer to take a closer look. It was information no one asked for, and that he offered anyway. Not elaborated, not detailed, just enough to say, this has a story. But it wasn't the time for that story yet. Why had he mentioned it? And why did the answer to that question seem to matter so much? That's when you know something matters. When you have to try that hard to convince yourself it doesn't. I spent the next week on that exercise. The harder I tried, the more I knew I was in trouble. I scheduled the follow-up to discharge the cow and sent my assistant in my place. Juninho was 19, helpful, and didn't ask personal questions about why I was changing my plans at the last minute. He was practical. I focused on the other clients. There was a small outbreak of worms on some properties in the northern part of the county, enough to keep me moving, my mind occupied with diagnoses and dosages and herd histories. Exhausted is good. Exhaustion won't let you think about what you don't want to think about. It was on a Thursday that Dona Edith invited me to dinner with a certain sparkle in her eyes I had already learned to recognize as a sign of impending complication. She had invited her niece to dinner. A very polite young woman, an accounting graduate from Sete Lagoas, visits whenever she can. The tone was that of someone presenting a solution nobody asked her to provide. The niece's name was Fernanda. She was 28, friendly, articulate, and well-meaning. She could carry a conversation about any topic you put on the table. I spent the whole dinner being the best version of the Lucas that doesn't exist. Attentive, pleasant, asking the right questions at the right moments, interested in stories that were safe for me to be interested in. It's a performance I rehearsed for years. It gets very easy after a while. So easy that sometimes you yourself lose the distinction between who is performing and who is present. Dona Edith kept looking at me during dinner with that satisfied smile of someone solving a problem they weren't asked to solve. And I smiled back, thanked her for the food and the company, and went to the bedroom. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a while without turning on the light. This is the real cost nobody talks about. It's not loneliness. I've got plenty of experience with that. And it's not fear. What it is, it's the weight of knowing that the people around you genuinely mean well. They want good things for you. Just the wrong things. Things that don't fit. And you can't say so without crushing what they're trying to give you. Dona Edith looked at me like I was the son she never had. And I'd let her down in ways she'd never quite be able to name. But she'd feel it the day I left. That thing perceptive people sense. Something the new vet isn't saying. A door behind the smile that doesn't open. I watched the hose swaying in the darkness and thought, this is how it ends. You perform the life that's offered, until that's all you've got left. The next morning, while getting coffee in the kitchen, I looked out at the street through the window and saw the red streak a farm truck had left on the asphalt. The specific kind of dust that lifts on a dry dirt road, clings to the wheels, and travels miles before falling off. I looked for longer than I should have. In the second week after I sent the assistant, Raphael showed up at the veterinary post, without an animal. He walked in through the front door at 10:30 in the morning with the calm of someone who has all the time in the world, and a clear reason he wasn't going to state. He greeted my assistant by name, which meant he already knew his name, had paid attention when introduced, didn't treat the people around him as scenery, and said he was in town and thought to stop by to see how the cow was doing, whether the treatment had worked as expected. My assistant was there. There were 2 other clients waiting in the room, one of them with a dog in a plastic crate. Nothing could happen, and nothing happened. The conversation was exactly what it said it was on the surface. I confirmed the cow had fully recovered, that there was no need for further visits, that the protocol had worked as planned. Raphael listened, thanked with his usual economy, and left. He stayed about 12 minutes. After the door closed behind him, Juninho, 19, who asked little but observed with the attention of someone learning everything about a new place, spoke without lifting his eyes from the form he was filling out. This guy is famous for being closed off. He doesn't come to town without a reason. I kept looking at the closed door for a moment. You know that moment when you stop making excuses and accept what's actually true? It's not dramatic. No fanfare, no big reveal. Just a small moment where you realize you're not lying to yourself anymore. It happened then, while I was looking at the closed door. Raphael had come to the clinic without an animal. He had driven 15 kilometers of dirt road to have a 12-minute conversation about a cow that had been cured days earlier, and that my assistant had already confirmed for him on the previous visit. And we both knew it wasn't about the cow. Maybe it never had been entirely about the cow. I was being sought out. The discovery didn't bring the joy I imagine it should have. It brought something more complicated. That specific mix of wanting something and being afraid of what wanting it will cost. The kind of feeling that doesn't have a clean name because it's more than one thing at once. But it was the first time in weeks that I felt actually present inside my own body, occupying every part of it, instead of contracting down to the bare minimum needed to function. A week later, I got a message from Raphael. Short text, his style. He'd found a heron that looked hurt near the pond at the back of the property. It wasn't urgent, but if I could take a look when I passed by the area, whenever I could. It was a phrase that left the timing in my hands. It wasn't urgency, it wasn't demand, it was an opening. I went the next day. The pond was in the most remote part of the farm, about a 15-minute walk from the main house, following a narrow path between the edge of the pasture and the low Cerrado scrub. Raphael went ahead, I followed, and neither of us talked much on the way. The trail was too narrow to walk side by side, which made the walk necessarily sequential. One after the other, the pace of the person in front setting the pace for the one behind. The silence between us was different from the usual silences. Not awkward, not evasive. It was shaped. It had weight. It was its own thing, held up by the two of us. The pond was small and beautiful. The red earthbank drank the late afternoon sun, and the water was so still it reflected the whole sky like a horizontal mirror. The smell was of damp mud and tall grass, and something you can't name, but that belongs to the Cerrado when the heat finally eases in the last parts of the day. That combination of earth and air and green that makes the Cerrado feel for a moment more alive than anywhere else. We found the heron. It was fine. It had probably stumbled on a branch and spooked some observer who couldn't tell discomfort from injury. No apparent problem. That took about 10 minutes. After that, we stayed. There was no explicit decision to stay. It simply happened the way important things sometimes do. Not as a conscious choice, but as tacit permission, both of us stopping the movement of leaving until staying became the natural state. We sat on the stones at the bank, Raphael a little forward and to the side, me a bit behind, the afternoon sinking with that slow, interior town end-of-day pace. And we began to talk, not all at once. First about the pond, about when Raphael's father had ordered the excavation, about what it supported in the good years when the water didn't fall too much. Then about other ponds Raphael knew in the area, about neighboring farms, about how cattle behave differently near water. Then about the land itself, about what it asks of those who care for it, about the difference between working the land and working with the land. Then about things that didn't have much to do with the land. Raphael said, looking at the light's reflection on the water's surface, "I don't have many people to talk to out here." It wasn't a complaint. It was a statement, said with the neutrality of someone who has learned to accept what is. I said, "I understand that feeling." And when I said it, not as a formula of sympathy, but as something true, Raphael looked at me in a way that wasn't an evaluation. It was recognition. The kind of look someone gives when they see in another person the same shape of a hole they have inside themselves, and that resemblance is at once comforting and unsettling. The sun kept sinking. Neither of us made a move to leave. The pond water sat still, and the surrounding Cerrado held a kind of silence that isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of too much to fit into words. There was the occasional call of a bird I didn't recognize. There was the wind that passed now and then, bending the tips of the tall grass on the opposite bank. There was the low, steady sound of plant life that exists even when you're not listening. A moment was coming. I felt it, not on the surface, where I was being careful with every word and gesture, but deeper, in the place where things are felt before they're thought. There was something in the space between us that was thickening, like that specific pressure before rain. And for the first time in I don't know how many years, I was letting it happen. I was present. I was here. Then Tiao's voice came from afar, firm and functional, calling Raphael's name for something at the main house. Distance distorted the words, but not the meaning. It was work urgency, the kind that doesn't wait. We both stood up at the same time, as if the movement were a shared reflex. Raphael called back aloud that he was coming. Tiao's voice faded into the distance across the property. And that moment that was forming, that pressure, that possibility I had stopped running from long enough for it to take shape, dissipated like smoke when the wind shifts direction. In seconds, there was no trace left. We walked back along the same trail in silence. When we reached the main house, I said goodbye to Raphael with the briefness of someone with things to do, got in the car, and left. On the road back, I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles went white and my palm hurt. We both pulled back. It wasn't planned, didn't have to be. Two men hiding from themselves. We know the instinct. It protects, it destroys, keeps you safe from real risks and from anything that'd make life worth living. Get too close to something real? The alarm goes off. Automatic, fast, devastatingly efficient. Raphael stopped texting. I didn't text Raphael. 2 weeks went by. Have you ever felt the weight of a silence you created yourself? The weird thing about being your own problem, you can't stop, because that would mean admitting what you're choosing not to have. Here's what nobody tells you about this kind of silence. It's not empty. It's full. Full of exactly what you were running from. It settles in your chest like stone. You wake up with it, the same thought, every morning. In those 14 days, I learned something about losing something you barely had. It's different. It's mourning a possibility instead of a real thing. And somehow that hurts worse. You can't even grieve something concrete. You're grieving a shape in the air. A moment that was about to happen and didn't. I dove into work. There was a lot to do. The vermin outbreak still required follow-up. One of the municipality's oldest properties had brought a complicated case of mastitis that took up 3 straight days. I went to Dona Edite's Sunday lunches. I listened to her stories, smiled at the right moments, asked the questions that kept her talking while I could stay silent and present at the same time. Life went on, which is what life does, with an indifference that sometimes borders on cruelty. But something was different now. I knew the name of what was missing. Before the pond, I could hide behind not knowing. I don't know what it is, so I can't be blamed for not chasing it. But now I knew. And once you name the thing, even just to yourself, it weighs different. That can't be undone. I couldn't stop thinking. What if I'd stayed? What if Tiao hadn't called, or if Raphael had said he'd wait? What would have happened on those rocks by the reservoir? What if I'd let that moment finish forming instead of getting up so quickly, with so much relief disguised as indifference? What if Raphael was going through the same 2 weeks I was? I'd stop thinking. I'd start again. I didn't sleep well. On the 17th morning of silence, I went to the farm for a routine check on another animal, a steer from the neighboring field that used the same pasture, and whose owner had requested a remote assessment. It wasn't Fazenda Esperanza specifically, but it was on the same dirt lane, and I'd have to pass the headquarters area. Raphael wasn't anywhere visible. I did what I had to do with the animal. Took notes, packed my bag. Tio showed up as I was leaving through the pasture's side gate. He was 55, the skin on his face and arms like leather tanned by sun and work, eyes with a particular clarity. The clarity of someone who's spent decades watching and learned that seeing attentively is more valuable than speaking often. He was carrying a hoe and headed toward the north pasture. He stopped me briefly to ask about the animal I'd examined. He knew every beast on the property by heart, by the nickname Raphael gave each one, by the health history, by the temperament. We talked for a few minutes. Easy, functional, professional. The kind of conversation that happens between two men who have work to do. and respect each other without needing excessive social protocol. As I was saying goodbye, Tiao tilted his head a little to the side, not exactly toward me, more toward the space in front of him, like someone speaking to the air but letting the words fall where they needed to, and said, while adjusting the hoe handle as someone about to start walking, "Raphael was like that once. Here but not here. You know when an animal is present but distant? When you call and it answers but the eyes are already gone? He was like that after the accident. It took time for him to come back to himself." He paused with the weight of a deliberate pause. He was coming back. Past tense. He was coming back. And then he went off down the dirt road without looking back, without asking anything, without offering any elaboration or any sign that he knew what he'd just done. He left the words in the air like someone leaving fruit on the table, not saying whether to eat it now or later, not demanding anyone pick it up. I went to the car. I sat with my hands on the wheel for a while without turning the engine on. Ever receive information that changes everything without anyone actually giving it to you? It just lands, at the right moment, for whoever's ready to hear it. Tiao hadn't said anything that could be quoted, nothing that'd get anyone in trouble. Just enough for whoever was ready to hear, not more, not less. He was coming back. I was. Past. Before I stepped back. Before both of us stepped back. I thought about Tiao, the man who'd worked that land his whole life, who knew every animal by name, who saw Raphael in a way nobody else could, and never made him pay for it, never demanded anything, never created that quiet debt people create when they know something about you that you never said. The debt of being seen and not destroyed. That kind of thing exists. Discreet, undeclared, built in silence over years, but real. I didn't know what to do with it yet. But for the first time since I'd arrived, I felt something. The possibility that the world isn't all cost. That there are places, rare, but real, where being who you are doesn't come with a price tag. I let 3 more days pass. Then the rain came. It came in the afternoon, the kind of real rain the backlands produce. Not a drizzle. A storm that turns the sky the wrong color, bends the grass, fills everything with the smell of wet earth and relief. 20 minutes and the red dirt turns to mud, the roofs pour, the roads almost disappear. I was at the clinic when it started. Juninho was gone, no more appointments, and I was alone, sitting on the counter, listening to the rain start, then build. Heavy rain on a roof sounds like percussion. Beautiful when you've got nothing to worry about underneath. I didn't decide. That's what matters. There wasn't a moment when I thought, I'm going to the farm. No deliberation, no weighing options. Just 15 minutes after the rain started, I was in the car, turning the key, driving. The dirt road was red and slick, tires sinking in the mud. I drove slow, careful, wipers barely keeping up. No pretext, no sick animal, no reason. Nothing I could say if someone asked why I was out there, soaked, no excuse ready. But Raphael's truck was parked outside when I arrived. Big, dark red, stopped under the covered area next to the house. I parked my car. I sat inside for exactly 1 full minute. I counted, without intending to, that specific way the heart counts when it's deciding something the head hasn't asked permission for. The rain hit the car's metal roof with the sound of sand dumped on sheet metal, constant and white. My hands had the damp cold of someone who had gripped the wheel too hard for too long. The house was there, the front window glowing a warm yellow, thin smoke rising from the chimney indicating a wood fire burning inside. I got out in the rain. Didn't run. Walked. Rain soaking through my shirt, hair plastered to my forehead. The smell of wet earth so intense it felt like the only real thing I'd ever felt. I knocked on the door. Raphael opened the door after a few seconds. Unhurried. Not expecting anyone. He just stood there looking at me. Soaked hair, shirt stuck to my chest. No explanation. Just someone who showed up because he had to. He stayed like that as long as he needed. Then he stepped back to let me in. The kitchen smelled of coffee and burning firewood and something cooking in a pot on the wood stove. A specific warm mix that belongs to a certain kind of Brazilian countryside I hadn't known before moving there. Raphael grabbed a folded towel from a shelf above the sink and placed it over my head without saying anything, without making a ceremony of it, like someone performing a necessary task. I dried my hair, while he returned to the pot on the stove, stirring with a wooden spoon, the rain making its steady noise outside. We stayed like that for a while. He at the pot, me drying my hair, the rain giving the whole world a closed, insulated quality, as if inside and out were different countries with impassable borders at that hour. I said, "Sorry for showing up like this." He said, "No need." That was it. That was Raphael. Then I was quiet for a while, looking at my hands. Then I talked. It wasn't eloquent. Not the version I'd write with time. Organized. Right words. Right places. It came out in pieces. Long pauses. Staring at the floor. Wrong words swapped for less wrong ones mid-sentence. Messy. Unrehearsed because it couldn't be. I said I didn't know how. That I didn't know if I could. That my whole life was built on not doing, not wanting, not seeing, not feeling, not letting any of it get named. That I came here thinking I could keep doing that forever. Safe. Quiet. Never having to be honest with anyone. Least of all myself. That Raphael had shown up and complicated it in a way I could no longer pretend hadn't happened. "I don't know how to do this," I said again. It was the truest sentence I had. Repeating it was the only way to give it the weight it deserved. Raphael stood at the stove with a spoon, listening. He got quiet when he listened, not waiting for his turn quiet. Receiving quiet. Like he knew the value of what was being given and wouldn't waste it. When I stopped talking, the silence lasted as long as it needed to. Then Raphael did something I didn't expect. He reached for the hem of his t-shirt. He lifted it. Second time seeing it. Completely different now. The first time was accident, far away, corral light, no context. Now we're inside. Close. Kitchen lamplight. Rain outside. Fire. Cooking smell. The weight of a moment that can't be taken back. The scar was at my level. Close, in the kitchen's warm light. All of it visible, without the distance of the corral, without the imprecise angle of a snapshot. Long and curved and old and real. Accident, 6 years ago. That was what he'd said on the second visit, with that casualness I had spent weeks trying to interpret. Now he was going to tell me the rest. There was a woman. Isabella. He named her. Naming things mattered to him. I'd learn that later. 2 years together. They'd planned marriage the way you do when you reach that point and there's no reason not to. He took care of her. She took care of him. Functional. 2 responsible adults building something real with what they had. Love was there. Real affection. Mutual respect. The kind of commitment that comes from honest choice, even when it's not. Everything. Then a man came. Temporary work on the neighboring farm. From another state. 2 months during harvest. Raphael didn't say his name. Just someone passing through. Nothing happened. No words. No gestures. But there was something Raphael recognized in him. Something familiar the wrong way. Something that made him look longer than he should. That pulled his eyes back without permission. Nothing happened. But Raphael understood what almost did. What he wanted. And it didn't come gradually, all at once, like ground giving way, sudden, total, irrevocable. That night, Raphael took the car. He didn't know where. Just the dirt road in the dark, too fast, not careless. The speed of someone not thinking about what's ahead because they can't stop thinking about what's behind. On some curve he knew by heart, one he'd taken hundreds of times. The car veered the wrong way. He was silent for a moment after saying that. The rain kept falling outside. The fireplace crackled. Then he said, without looking at me, "I'm not saying it was on purpose. I'm not saying it wasn't." The scar was what remained. 3 broken ribs, a week in the hospital, 2 months of slow recovery. The marriage with Isabella ended gently soon after. She was perceptive enough to know there was something he couldn't give her, even if she couldn't name it exactly, and sensible enough not to demand he name it. Raphael hadn't told that version to anyone, not to Tiao, who knew everything about him without Raphael having said a word. Not to any doctor, who had documented the accident without reason to question it. Not to any friend who had visited the hospital with the solidarity of those who believe the surface story. Not to anyone, ever. Until that night, he looked at me when I finished. Not like someone waiting to judge. Like someone who had just opened a window he'd never opened before, and wanted to know if the air outside was different from what he imagined. 6 years carrying this alone, I said. It was an observation. There was no judgment in it, and I needed him to know that. Sometimes the weight becomes familiar, he said. You stop feeling it. You stop knowing whether you're still carrying it, or if it's already become part of who you are. I knew that better than anything. That was exactly how I'd lived. Weight so familiar you stop feeling it. Can't tell where you end and the hiding starts. We sat in silence for a while. The rain kept falling. The fire in the hearth made its usual sound. The steady crackle of wood turning to ash. The constant warmth spreading through the kitchen. The pot on the stove had gone out long ago, and neither of us had noticed. Then I moved. Not quick. Not impulsive. Just a decision that was already made somewhere deeper, and the body finally obeying. I stepped closer. Touched the scar with my fingers. Lightly. Not clinical, not analytical. Carefully. Like touching something that cost him everything. Wanting him to know I understood the cost. In the way my fingers landed. In the exact weight of my hand. Raphael stayed still. Then, slowly, he placed his hand over mine. We stayed. The rain outside eased. The way it does in Minas, not sudden. It quiets in waves until you realize it's just the eaves dripping. Wet earth smell coming through the windows. Alive. The town outside was still the same. Boa Esperança with its red soil, its dry heat, its silence full of unsaid things. Its web of looks that see everything. Dona Edith in the living room with cats and TV. Tiao probably in the dark, patient, waiting like he always had. The world hadn't changed. No new right. No threat gone. The town was still the town, with all its cost and possibility. But something between us had been named. Not with big words or declarations. Just two men in a farmhouse kitchen with their hands on an old scar, silence after rain, wood crackling in the hearth. And that was enough. Not an ending. A beginning. Small things. Things that fit in a hand. Fragile. Can be destroyed by carelessness. But if you keep attention, they grow toward the light like Cerrado after fire. The Cerrado burns. It comes back. Different. More resilient. Roots dug deep. I don't know what comes next. The town will be the town. Days where the cost feels too high. Fear, his and mine. They look the same. The thing we carry in a place where being who you are has a price nobody says but everyone collects. But there is also this. Two men who stopped pretending to be something else for each other. Sometimes that's all you need to start. Ever feel the weight of something you hid so long you forgot what it was like to carry it without hiding? That moment when just one person, not the whole world, just one, sees, stays, and touches what you thought was untouchable. This is it. If anything in this story sounded familiar to you, if you saw yourself in Lucas, in Raphael, in the weight they carried, or in the small and enormous relief of not carrying it alone anymore, tell us in the comments. These stories exist because you recognize them, and recognition is already a way of not being alone. If you're at any point in this journey, at the beginning, retreating, in the silence of the 2 weeks, in the moment before the rain, this channel exists for that. So you know you're not the only one who feels what you feel. If this story stayed with you, leave a like and stick around. There are more stories that need to be told.